Okay, I am thrilled to welcome Heidi to the Sasaga podcast. So Heidi, please tell us who you are and what you do.
Thank you for having me. I'm Heidi Karino. I'm a trans creation specialist for content marketing translation. Basically, I translate marketing stuff from Japanese to English.
Okay, and we're going to definitely get more into that topic in a moment because many listeners may not have even heard of what trans creation actually is. But first of all, let's go with word of the year.
Okay, so this was actually the first year that I ever chose a word of the year. And I chose Su from Sugao. Because I wanted to have a more authentic year. I wanted to be more authentic to myself, to what I wanted to do. And I just felt that kanji really represented the year that I wanted to have.
That is brilliant. And I love that, this is the only the second time that we've had mention of a kanji for the word of the year. It was Tracy Gopal who mentioned that a few episodes ago. She had Kokozashi, which I thought was great. So just briefly, could you tell us a little bit more about how that's supported you? Because we are actually recording this towards the end of the year. So how has having that as your word of the year or kanji of the year supported you?
Well, I obviously chose that in in January. And I moved to the UK in April after being in Japan for 23 years. And being more authentic, obviously that didn't just happen instantly as soon as I chose that word. But it was a reminder that the decisions that I was making them because I wanted to make them, not because I had to, not because somebody was making me do it. So whenever I felt unsure or lost or wondered if it was really the right thing to do, I would just remind myself that it is the right thing to do because it's what I want to do. So on a deeper level, that's how I would say it supported me. And I think being more truthful, being more just myself has had an effect on my family as well, who also feel kind of more comfortable in themselves. So yeah, it's my word, but I feel like as a theme for our family, it's been something that has really helped us through this quite difficult transition to the UK. Yeah.
Right. So that's a great way to look at authenticity as well, is that being true to your own decisions and not being so much, because it's very easy to be influenced by other people's decisions. That's really great. And then for family, could you share with us how many children, what children you have?
Sure, yeah. I have two daughters. My eldest is 15. So in Japan, that would be first year of high school. My youngest is 12. So she would be first year junior high school in Japan. And as I said, we moved in April as they were going up an academic year in Japan, and then they made the shift to school in the UK.
Right. And what was difficult, if you don't mind sharing, about that whole transition? Was it really related to the kids, or you were in Japan for 23 years, so that's quite a move.
Well, practically, I mean, we had to get rid of all of our stuff and like physically move our life from one country to another, bureaucratically. Just the legal side of making sure that we had all our documents in place. And then financially, I had to make sure that my business was going to be enough to support us when we came to the UK. So as a translator, as a Japanese to English translator, all of my clients are based in Japan. So moving to a different country was so many difficult issues. And then once we got here, it's trying to adjust to life in a country that none of us have really lived in. I mean, my children have never lived here. My partner went to university in England, so he's familiar with the UK, and he went to university near where we live now. But I haven't lived in UK for 20 odd years, and even when I was here, I tend to move around quite a lot. I went to a boarding school, and my parents lived overseas, so you couldn't really say that I'm used to the UK either, and I've never lived here as an adult. So you have the honeymoon period where you eat a lot of cheese and pasties and sausage rolls. But then after that, it's like, well, where do I get soy sauce, and where do I buy decent tofu? Like, what is this country? It's so very, very strange. So, and also we're living with my parents while we wait for our house to be completed. So all of that. So trying to not only adjust to a new environment, but trying to just get through this transition period as a family. It was really important to remind ourselves, or remind myself, why we made this decision. And that we made this decision because I was ready to leave Japan. I felt that Japan was a place which I'd learned to grow up in. I'd become an adult in Japan. I'd made, a really successful career in Japan, but it was time for me to move on to a different country, and it didn't have to be England. It wasn't that we all decided to go back to the UK. It was simply that it was easier for us to go to the UK. We have family, and just visa-wise, it was just more practical to come here. So even though it's been difficult adjusting, that I think Sue has just really helped us to kind of find our foundation. So you could tie it up to culture. I mean, I'm neither Japanese nor English. I'm just Heidi. I'm just who I am. So yeah, I think from that respect, the word was really spot on, I think, for me this year.
That is a great word. I love it. And so you touched a little bit upon your work. So let's go in a little bit more into that. And I know that because I have quite an extensive background, excuse me, in translation. I spent many years of my career as a translator. I was the president of JAT, Japan Association of Translators, which I know that you're very, very much involved in now. And so we could really easily totally geek out on this. We have to keep our Sasuga podcast listeners in mind as we talk. So I would actually say maybe we even talk from the very, very basics, because I would say quite a lot of people actually get confused about what a translator is, because there's that confusion with honyaku and tsuyaku. And sometimes people think that translator is tsuyaku. So I don't know. Do you have any comments on that before we get into the transcreation level of things?
Sure. I mean, I am a terrible, terrible interpreter at tsuyaku. I cannot do it because I think because of the nature of the translation that I do, I really like to choose my words and think about whether or not I am conveying the meaning as it's intended. Whereas with an interpreter, you need to make an instant decision. You need to be able to process that information very, very quickly and communicate it as succinctly as possible. They're two very, very different skills which have very, very different training. So I can interpret for my parents and my in-laws, but not really, not professionally. It's something which I just don't really have the capacity for, I think.
Yeah, it's like when you can have two musicians, one's a violinist but a violinist can't necessarily play the trumpet. It's almost that kind of thing, isn't it?
Yeah. I mean, that's I think that's a perfect example. Yeah, definitely.
And then I had one of my translator friends, because I often hear people saying we need a translator, for example, but they actually mean that they need an interpreter. And she received a request, and she was asking about the details of the engagement. And they said, yes, we'd like you to translate in front of 200 people. Is that okay? And she was like, so what, you're going to like set up a desk for me? And like, how does this work? And she hadn't realized that initially that they were talking about interpreting. She was like, oh, I'm a translator. It's a different thing. So there's that distinction, which hopefully our listeners are clear on now. But talk about transcreation. So this is probably even less known at the moment. So tell us about, enlighten us.
Sure. So the way that transcreation is defined depends on the person who's talking about it. So my definition of transcreation could differ to other people's, but I would say in marketing, how I define transcreation is pretty much the accepted definition. Mm-hmm. So when you translate something, you change it from one language to another, and you try to make sure you have all the information that's in the text, and it should read naturally in the language. This is a very creative process. So all translation is creative. The difference between translation and transcreation is transcreation has to take into consideration the target market and the purpose of the text. And how I explain this to people is, if you have a Japanese website and you translate it into English, then what you have is English content targeting a Japanese audience. And how you sell things to Japanese people, how you appeal to Japanese people is going to be very, very different to how you appeal to an English audience. So what I do is I translate it, but I also use copywriting techniques, marketing knowledge to transcreate it so that it says what the Japanese says. It has the same intent, but it also achieves the same purpose and is now targeting an English-speaking audience. So that's what transcreation is.
Right. And it's amazing that this is so little understood. A lot of people seem to think that you can have one word in Japanese and put it into one word in English, and it is absolutely not the case, right? Have you Can you think of any like specific examples of where like something has I don't know, been a bit disastrous going into English from Japanese? I don't know if you have any.
It's a little difficult to think of specific examples, because I would say in general, Japanese is a passive language and low context. So you don't need a lot of context when you're speaking in Japanese. And I deal with mostly like digital marketing content, so blogs, websites, and also like advertising slogans. And in Japanese, these tend to be very vague, open to interpretation, and that works in Japanese because you don't need a lot of context. You have a shared understanding. But when you translate that into English, the vagueness of it becomes, it's almost as if you can't trust it, because they're not clear on their messaging. They're not saying it. And it's the same with passive language. So in Japanese, you wouldn't say, I don't know, I want this. You would say, できればいただきたいんですが, you would soften it, but that's not suspicious. That's polite. That's how you would talk, right? You would soften your language, and that's how you communicate. But English, especially now, is more about being direct. That's politer, to be clear in your messaging, to say, we want you to do this, we can do this for you, we have this great quality service. So everything is very, very different in the way you communicate. So it would be hard to pick a particular example. Like for me personally, I think all digital marketing content should have an element of transcreation or copywriting in it to adapt it, especially between Japanese and English, which are two very, very different cultures.
I fully agree. And, it's really related to, presentation skills, communication skills that I talk about a lot, because what I often say is it's all about the audience. And, you can have the same presentation like content, basically, but depending on the audience that you're talking to, like if you're talking to some very senior Japanese executives compared to some Japanese high school students, you know, even that with the same language, you're going to have a different way of communicating. So even more when it's a different language and it's a different culture.
Yeah, exactly.
So let's imagine like Japanese people working in a Japanese or a global company, for example, Japanese people working in a global company, and they have material that they need to translate, and then in some cases they will, you know, they'll outsource that. In some cases, I know that they attempt to do it by themselves. So just for those two scenarios, what advice do you have?
Well, if you're going to outsource it to a translation agency or someone like me, it would be, you would more likely outsource it to a translation agency. I think it's very I work with some corporations, but yes, it's more likely. And if you are outsourcing to a translation agency, I would just make sure that the translator they were assigning the job to knew what they were doing. There are translators with lots and lots of different skills, creative translators, people who translate games, people who translate technical documents, people who translate financial documents. And there are a lot of marketing translators, but marketing translation in Japan is a huge category, which can cover everything from IR to blogs. So when you make the request, you need to be very clear on what it is you want to achieve. For example, I work with one client who they were working with a translation agency on their social media posting, but they found that the posts were too much of a direct translation, and they asked me if I could help them. And they want to gain followers on their social media account. And the difficulty they were having is they were writing things in Japanese and it was being translated. So it's incredibly polite, very, as I said before, very vague, very kind of circling around the issue. Whereas in English, we just say, thank you for following us. But in Japanese, it would say, I don't know, like something very, very long. And I think the translation agency could probably have done that for them if they had somebody in their registrar who knew something about digital marketing or knew something about social media. The problem when you make a request to a translation agency is they will usually just give the project to somebody who is available for the rate that you are willing to pay. And that's another thing. If you want to work with somebody who is an expert in digital marketing, then you have to be prepared to have the budget. So that's if you're outsourcing. Just make sure you give the brief and also you're clear about what you want, your goals. If you were doing it yourself, then I would recommend first looking at what your competitors are doing in English. If it's a website, I think that would be really hard to do on your own. But if it's social media, so for example, like LinkedIn, company pages have LinkedIn. See what your competitors are doing in the US or the UK. Look at what kind of tone they're using to speak to the audience. See how people are reacting. If it's not LinkedIn, if it's a different platform, if it's a blog, again, see what kind of tone people are using in the industry. Are they using a formal tone, a high-tech tone? Are they using a friendly tone? Does that match with your brand? What kind of words are they using? Are these the words which you're using in Japanese, or is it a totally different vocabulary? So I always recommend people who have English, who are adept at English, if they're writing marketing contents for their Japanese brand, to write it in English and have somebody check it for them, rather than write it in Japanese first. Because if you are skilled in English, you're going to have a different voice in English to your Japanese voice, and that's probably going to be closer to the audience that you're speaking to. So, and I think when it comes to digital contents, people are a lot more forgiving about the English as well. If it's authentic, going back to that, if the voice is authentic, even if your English is perhaps not, even if you're not totally bilingual, if the voice is authentic and it's on brand, then people are quite forgiving about, mistakes. It's when something is clearly machine translated, I think that's when people are a little bit more suspicious.
This is such a great point. I'm really happy that you brought this up, because a lot of people might not even have thought of that. They might think, I write it in Japanese first, and then I'll get someone to translate it, or I'll write it in Japanese first, and then I'll attempt to translate it myself, either of those two ways. But when you do, if you've got that certain level of English to start with, by drafting it in English in the first place, it is going to make a huge difference. That's
I think so. I mean, in my social media, I do the same, because it makes you aware of who you're talking to. So if I were to write something in English, I'm thinking about other translators. Whereas when I write something in Japanese, I'm thinking about a Japanese audience. So naturally, that's going to affect what I write and the content and the angle and the perspective. So I think, it's if you have that ability, and even if your ability is not that advanced, it will give you a totally different perspective in what you're writing. Yeah.
And I love your point as well about it actually doesn't have to be perfect. It's more important that it's in the voice. This is, again, what I talk about in communication all the time, is that it's not about having perfect grammar or perfect pronunciation or all these really sophisticated vocabulary. It's about the kind of the communication from the heart. It's the authenticity. That's what really makes a connection. That's so great. I want to go back to 2 more points, and because I do believe this is important to raise awareness about. Like you and I, we know a lot of this already. A lot of people are not so aware maybe about the time required for creative translation or transcreation, and the fees involved, because the thing is that these days there's a lot of machine translation out there, which has actually, it has improved, considering compared to some years ago. Sometimes I'll see some machine translation, I'm like, oh, that's actually getting a little bit closer, but still there are so many potential pitfalls. So in terms of, if you could just say a little bit more about that, the time required for the creativity and the fees that, the sort of the value of that investment, maybe.
Well, yeah. So obviously, I think the type of translation that I do is the only type of translation you should be doing if you're marketing. Any other translation is just decorative. All you're doing is you're putting English on your website, but it's not serving you any kind of function. And it's very easy to do that kind of translation. I mean, if you asked me to simply translate someone's website, take it from Japanese into English, it wouldn't take very long at all. As long as I knew the industry. I mean, there's research involved in any kind of translation. But when it comes to transcreation, I mean, it's basically the same as copywriting. And I'm sure people in business, well, I know in Japan, a lot of companies write their marketing material in-house, but also a lot, outsource it. So if you were creating a website, you wouldn't ask anybody in the marketing department to write the copy for that. You would ask either a professional content writer or someone within the department who knew about marketing, who knew how to express your products or services. And then when it comes to transcreation, I would start my process with, first I would do a translation of the materials, just so that I can get a feel for what it is that I'm having to deal with. Then I would research all of the materials that I had from the company, which would hopefully include their branding messaging, their tone of voice requests, if they had any in English, what type of target they were hoping to appeal to, what values they had, all that information that would help to give me some background. Then I would go and see how people in the same industry in the UK and the US, or wherever their target market was, were presenting their values and their skills, what kind of language they were using. And then if I have the resources, I would look at VOC, so voice of customers, what the customers are saying, what they want, what kind of language they're using. So this would involve, Google, where you can do like a query search. You can see what kind of questions they're putting in there. I don't really go much. I am qualified to do SEO, which is search engine optimization. I'm sure a lot of your listeners are familiar with that, but I would never call myself an SEO professional. But if you are transcreation, you do at least need to have a working knowledge of on-page SEO to be able to do that. So even before, so at this stage, I've done a draft translation. So what I've got is a bit of English, and then I've got all of this information. And then after I've done that, then I start to construct the text with that. And then I would return that, I would get feedback, and then that would take. So I would say with transcreation, with normal translation, I think at least, 40 to 50% is research, assuming it's a new project that you haven't worked on before. But with transcreation, I would say it's closer to 80%, and it takes a lot of research, and that's what you're paying for. So I usually charge by the hour for transcreation, or by the project. If it's something that I've worked on before, I have an idea of what this kind of project, how long it will take me, and then I'll just quote on a project basis.
Right. Yeah, because that's another whole topic which we don't need to get into, but
yes.
The way that people charge, like whether it's per word of source character, whether it's per word of target language, and there's been over the years different trends there. But because I remember, it was very common at one point to have the per word of target language, so per word of English would dictate the fee, but then you get translators who are writing long waffly English because they get paid more that way. That's no good.
Yeah, it was pretty counterintuitive. So I think going back to value, I'm not gonna lie, it costs more money. I cost more money than your average translator. But the translation that I provide does more than the average translator. And if you go through me direct, so if you were to go through a translation agency, they can do it a lot quicker than me, and sometimes they can do it cheaper than me. I'd say the price is pretty much the same, but you don't have the input. You can rarely talk to the translator themselves. You're usually dealing with the Madoguchi, or maybe you might be able to talk to the project manager, not very likely. So you have about 2 or 3 people in the middle there, and it's your brand, it's your company, and you want to tell people about it, but the person who is responsible for that, you can't even talk to them. So for me, I work with a really, really amazing translation company who I obviously can't mention here, and they are very hands-on. They make sure that they do all the stuff I don't like, all the bureaucratical stuff, but they make sure that if required, I can talk directly to the client can talk to me. So that's the ideal setup. And I'm always surprised when clients don't want to talk to me. They're just happy to let me do it myself. So it should be a huge investment, because having English content makes you a global company, and people should really take it a lot more seriously than they are, I think. So sorry, I'll get off my soapbox now.
Well, I want you to get back on it because there's just one more topic I want to talk about translation, then we can just go on to other topics a little bit maybe. But I wanted to invite you as a guest because I am very passionate about this whole topic of translation, because I would say quite a lot of people are misinformed, or they're just not informed about translation, and that does them a disservice. So I'm hoping that we can sort of enlighten people here. So the other one I did want to get you back on your soapbox about, because I'm guessing is you said very clearly that you translate from Japanese to English. Could you say a little bit about that in terms of translating language direction, because I know a lot of people think, oh, you're a translator. Does it matter whether it's Japanese? Oh my goodness, I just remembered this great story. I was at an international meeting, and I was the interpreter at that meeting. So, this is actually interpreting, and I was doing the spoken interpreting. And it was people, all these representatives from different countries, and so I'm going back and forth between English and Japanese. And then I forget what country it was, but a chap started talking, and he suddenly started with Spanish and expected me to be able to do the Spanish. Because I was the interpreter, and I'm like, I did study Spanish in high school, but it's not at the level that I could interpret in this meeting. So with that little story aside, what are your thoughts on the whole language direction topic?
Right. So this is actually something that I've spoken about recently on LinkedIn. But I started off my career as an English to Japanese translator, but I would never have had my translation go out there without the editing of my colleague who I worked very closely with for 15 years. And he would always fix my Japanese. And I feel very strongly that when it comes to creative translation, you need to be translating into your first language. And if you're bilingual, perhaps you have two first languages. I'm not bilingual. My Japanese is good, and I write in Japanese for my personal social media. But for my website, for example, I hired a Japanese copywriter to do that. And I know that there are some people who translate English to Japanese, Japanese to English, who translate both ways. Only a few people can do that well, I think. That's my opinion. And I feel that really, if communicating is your priority, then you should be hiring somebody who translates into their first language. So me personally, I would never, and I have been asked, I mean, I get asked all the time to translate English to Japanese, and my mum said, couldn't you just do that? Speak Japanese, but understanding a language and being able to communicate in a way that resonates are two totally different things. What did I recently? I said, style and staru, they're totally different things, right? So I can staru in Japanese, but whether that's staru, I haven't spoken Japanese in so long. Staru, I think it's very different, and I think you really need that first language ability. Although saying that, I mean, I know there are lots of people who have worked very, very hard on that and can do it. I'm not one of them, and I'm aware of that. I prefer to focus on English. I think I enjoy communicating in English, and it's a language that I feel very, very comfortable in. So I do not do English to Japanese.
Yeah, I'm absolutely with you on that. I remember in my corporate days, and a translation agency came to kind of promote their services to me. And they were, I was asking them several questions, like you said earlier on, if you're working with a translation agency, check them out, make sure that they really are following best practice. And so I said, when you have translations into English, are you using a native speaker of English for that? And the guy said to me, he's like, no, foreigners can't speak Japanese. Excuse me, we were talking in Japanese at the time.
Yeah, I've had that before. I've seen comments which say, well, I don't want to hire a native English speaker because they won't be able to understand the nuances of the Japanese language. And then I actually said, okay, so perhaps when you translate from English to Japanese, you'd prefer to hire me. Because maybe Japanese people can't understand the nuances of the English language. And I think that made them begin to consider that way of thinking is a little old-fashioned. I mean, yeah, in the past, there weren't many native English speakers who had a good comprehension of Japanese. And you did require Japanese translators to translate into English. And there are a lot of people in the industry, so I don't want to disvalue what my colleagues are doing. There are a lot of Japanese translators who are really good at translating into English. But this perception that a native speaker cannot do it because they don't have a good grasp of Japanese, that's just ridiculous. And yeah, people really need to get over that, I think.
Well, I mean, so this little story I want to share with you as well, this is from many, many years ago, but in my very early days in Japan, and I was going for a job interview as a translator, and just as we were having the conversation, it suddenly transpired in the conversation that I could read Japanese, and they were so surprised by this. I said, but this is a translation job. I said, and this is replacing somebody else. I said, how is that person doing the job now? And they said, oh, one of our Japanese colleagues explains the Japanese to the person, and then she writes it in English. That was their translation process.
Wow. Yeah.
Yeah. So all sorts of stories. Okay, so I think we've done the was there anything else you want to say about translation before we move on?
No, that's fine. We can move on.
I just really want to get this message out there a little bit, though. So Sasuga success cycle. So if we think about the 4 phases of the Sasuga success cycle, around self-care, around planning, communication, and productivity, what's an area where you could share with us a little story, maybe something you've struggled with in the past? Maybe it's translation related, I don't know. What would you like to share with us where we can have a little bit of inspiration for the Sasuga podcast listeners?
Well, I think communication is probably the thing that I have struggled with in the past on many different levels. And I think that's also what led me to choose for my my word this year. So perhaps because I went to Japan when I was 20. I went to university in Japan. And I worked in Japan. So basically, my whole adult life, becoming an adult, was spent in Japan. And because of that, I would say I've been very influenced by the Japanese way of communicating. So I tend not to say what I think directly. I tend to internalize quite a lot. I find it very difficult to say no, even if I'm uncomfortable. And when I was in 2020, I gave up an in-house job at Tokyo Disney Resort. I really loved that job, but I found that full-time work just wasn't really working with my family and just me in general. And when that happened, I realized that for a long time I'd been feeling very, very unhappy, and I just hadn't been able to kind of communicate that, basically, to get that out there. And it took me a long time to find out what it was that I wanted to do, and what it was that how I was going to do it, and to kind of explain to my family how I was feeling and what I needed to do. And then from a business point of view, practically, I found it really difficult to show people what I could do. So we were talking about transcreation, and one of the reasons I decided to do that is because I really think that people are wasting their money on translation for marketing, and I felt really bad about taking people's money when all they wanted was this literal translation, which wasn't doing anything at all. And I wanted people to know that what they were doing was not effective. But I really, and I would say even now, I'm having trouble trying to find the channels where I can communicate that, where I can kind of make a change in people's consciousness about what translation is or about the purpose of their English language contents. So I would say I am in phase 3 right now. I'm trying to communicate myself as a person. I'm trying to be a lot more vocal about when things are making me feel uncomfortable, or when I feel when a situation is making me feel quite anxious. Certain situations, especially living with my parents after so long, in the past, I would have just let them go, even though they made me really, really uncomfortable, and I would just let it stew. Now I'm trying to say, this situation is the type of situation which is a trigger for me, and it's going to make me feel really, really anxious if we don't clear it up now. So I'm trying to be a little bit more. I mean, it's not something that you can change immediately just with a magic word, but I am trying to communicate that a little bit more, I think. Yeah.
I love how it all ties together so well around communication and Sue, and also this is very related to self-care, you know, that topic, because by being more authentic, by communicating what you really feel, that helps with your self-care from the kind of mental and emotional perspective. You know, the self-care is not just the physical aspects of self-care. I think that's wonderful. So you have the channel here, by the way, to communicate and raise the consciousness about what translation is. So that's great. So what else would you like to share with the Sasaga podcast listeners today?
So I think that I mean, I've listened to the Sasaga podcast. Oh, just as an aside, whenever somebody gives me feedback, if they say "Sasuga Heidi-san," that's the best feedback that I ever get. So if you ever want to make me smile, that's the word that does it. Yeah, I love it when people say that to me. But I did actually want to talk a little bit about how I got to where I am now. I know we've been talking for a long time, so I'll just try to keep it quite short. But in 2020, I was in a really, really bad place. I just left a job which I was very good at and I was very successful at. And I looked at the translation industry and nobody was willing to pay me what I was worth. The translation industry is set up in the longer you work for an agency, the higher the rate becomes. But even with a career of 20 years and working for Tokyo Disney Resort, so employed by Oriental Land, I still could not get a decent rate. And I stopped. So I decided to take a step back and think about what I wanted to do, where I wanted to be, and how I could make this happen. And I think if I hadn't have done that, I would still be working for very, very low rates, and I would still be in Japan. I would not have been able to make this shift. So people have often said to me, you're very lucky that you could go to England and that you have your own business, as if it's something that they couldn't do. But that's not true at all. I think it's very difficult to step back and assess your life, especially then. I think it was like 40 when I did that. At 40, to step back and think seriously about what you need to do to make things happen, to live the life that you really want to live. And especially in Japan, where it feels like you don't have many options, and as a woman and as a mother, you can feel quite trapped in some ways or limited, but that doesn't mean you can't plan. So I took a step back and I had a plan, and I'm in the process of doing that plan to a bigger goal. So I really want people to, and that, like you said, that's self-care, to do that, to take that time to step back and really think seriously about if what they're doing right now is what's making them happy. And if it's not, then think about what will make you happy. What kind of life would make you happy? What kind of day would make you happy? And then see how you can make that a reality, because there's no reason why you couldn't. There's nothing to stop you from doing that. And just to have a little bit more positive energy and belief in yourself. I really wanted to mention that today.
Well, I am so thrilled that you actually brought this up, because it's huge. And I see this a lot, that people are like, oh, I'm stuck where I am. And it's not even just the impact that it has on the individual, but that the impact that it has on the people around as well. So like, you know, on your family, friends, colleagues, it has just a tremendous impact. And you know, my signature women's coaching program, the Sasika VIP Women's Coaching Program, is a 3-month program, and that's where a lot of women will actually take that time to step back and start to reflect and say, wait a minute. And then they see the other women in the group and like, oh, that's actually possible, and that's actually possible. And number of women who've gone through that program and have had decided basically they wanted to change their job, or move countries even. You know, we've had that so many times throughout the program. And I fully agree that it's really, it can be really hard when you've got so much going on a day-to-day basis, and it's like, just deal with the thing that's right in front of you, but it's really mottai nai, right?
Yeah, definitely.
Just the importance of, okay, just take a little step back and consider, you know, what could life look like? And like you say, the possibilities that are out there these days, we've never been in such a time of opportunity. Like, even though there's so much going on in the world, I would say we've never been in such a time of opportunity. Yeah. Great. I love that. Inspiring. So for those Sasika podcast listeners who would love to get in touch with you, Heidi, and maybe you know, ask more about you, or looking for transcreation services as well, where's the best place to find you?
LinkedIn. I'm really active on LinkedIn. You can connect with me there or follow me there. I'm doing, I don't know when this goes out, but in December, I'm doing a 24 tips for Japanese translators, which even if you're not a Japanese translator, kind of gives you an idea of what makes Japanese language such a tricky language to translate into English, and easy fixes that you could do just to make your English a little bit more natural. But yeah, I'm always posting about Japanese translation and just things about the industry. So you can find me there.
Brilliant. We'll link in the show notes. And that is, yes, this will be going out in December. So podcast listeners who are interested, definitely go and check that out. It sounds brilliant. Okay. Well, Heidi, thank you so much. It's been such a pleasure chatting with you today. And we're actually in the same country at the moment, because I'm here visiting the UK and you're here. So we're like, yay. Good to speak in the same time zone as well. Okay. So thank you so much, and make it a brilliant and joyful day, everybody.